In fact, it is quite natural that a religion that rejects blood transfusions, encourages family members to stop speaking to relatives who have been expelled, and has repeatedly predicted the end of the world without getting it right, would attract the attention of journalists, researchers, and documentary producers. There is also another important point to keep in mind. In the documentary itself, HBO includes a disclaimer explaining that they invited Jehovah's Witnesses to participate and present their point of view. However, the organization declined the invitation, and of course, from their perspective, it is much more convenient to adopt the role of victim than to sit in front of a broad audience and respond with reasonable arguments to the criticisms that are being raised. So there is no conspiracy between the devil, the apostates, and HBO. HBO is simply a media company that did its job, and my conclusion after watching the documentary is very simple. Jehovah's Witnesses ended up falling into their own trap. Why? In order to understand why I say that Jehovah's Witnesses fell into their own trap, we first need to understand what the HBO video, or rather, the HBO miniseries, about Jehovah's Witnesses is about. In the miniseries, several former Spanish Jehovah's Witnesses appear, sharing their experiences. Throughout the episodes, they describe what their lives were like inside the organization and what the process of leaving it was like. And as they tell their stories, different very delicate issues related to Jehovah's Witnesses begin to emerge. These are all the topics that, when someone who is not a witness hears about them, they probably think something like, if this is what Jehovah's Witnesses are like, I don't want to be one of them. We should keep in mind that, unlike a YouTube video, HBO miniseries reach millions, literally millions, of people around the world. So what topics are we talking about? Well, for example, one that might seem minor, but actually isn't. The use of the term worldly. Jehovah's Witnesses use the term worldly to refer to people who are not Jehovah's Witnesses. And that term carries an implicit sense of contempt, but beyond that, it's a word that allows them to establish a very clear division between the good people, which are them, and the bad people, or the worldly. And this is something typical of almost all sects, dividing the world between good and evil, between those who will be saved and those who will not. The series also mentions the subject of Armageddon, and how it is used as a tool of psychological pressure on members. And this is quite interesting because one of the things that has always caught my attention is that Jehovah's Witnesses often criticize Christendom, saying that for centuries, the doctrine of hellfire has been used to frighten people and manipulate them. But this is a classic case of seeing the speck in someone else's eye while ignoring the beam in one's own. Because Jehovah's Witnesses use Armageddon in exactly the same way. They use it to generate fear among their members, and that fear is one of the reasons why many people are afraid to leave the organization. In a way, they have been indoctrinated for so many years that the doubt remains persistent. What if Armageddon comes and I'm destroyed? The documentary also touches on the subject of birthdays and Christmas, but from the perspective of children. Most of the people who appear in the documentary were actually born inside the organization, and they describe how they felt at school. Many recount how they constantly felt like the odd ones in the classroom, the ones who had to step aside when others celebrated birthdays. For example, one of them explains that when he was a child, if someone offered him birthday candy, he was supposed to refuse it and say, I don't celebrate birthdays because I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But he himself admits that he never had the courage to do that. What he did instead was accept the candy, and later, when no one was looking, throw it in the trash so he wouldn't feel guilty. These kinds of testimonies show very clearly the situation many Jehovah's Witness children experience. On the one hand, the difficulty of being different at school, and on the other hand, the constant feeling of guilt when they fail to live up perfectly to the organization's standards, as their parents expect them to. The series also mentions the famous rod of discipline, which for decades was used to keep children quiet during meetings. And another aspect appears that many will remember, when children had to go door-to-door preaching with their parents, dressed formally, and how many of them felt embarrassed when they ran into classmates from school. All of these issues appear in the documentary. And of course, Jehovah's Witnesses do not come across very well to the general public. Another important point discussed is the baptism of children. Several of the people in the documentary say they were baptized at a very young age, and later, as they grew older, they realized that some of the things they had accepted with that baptism were actually things they did not want to live by. For example, some of them spoke about their sexual orientation, being gay or lesbian. Of course, Jehovah's Witnesses are not the only Bible-based religion that rejects homosexuality, but they are virtually the only one that instructs parents to stop speaking to their children once they are removed. For decades, many Jehovah's Witness parents have treated their children who were removed as if they had died, And although recently, they have softened their position slightly, allowing, for example, brief contact to invite them to meetings. The reality is that they still cannot socialize with them normally. Someone might say, well, if the child still lives at home, the parents do speak to them, and that is true. But once the child leaves home, in practice, it is as if they no longer exist, as if they had died. Many of the former witnesses in the documentary describe exactly what it has been like to live with that family rejection. Another issue discussed is the culture of covering up sexual abuse within the organization. And of course, this is something extremely delicate and emotionally charged. For example, the documentary mentions the well-known two-witness rule. According to this internal rule, for elders to take action against an abuser, there must be at least 2 witnesses to the act. But in cases of this kind of abuse, there are almost never witnesses. So in practice, many abusers are never punished within the congregation. The documentary presents some truly extreme cases. For example, the case of a 14-year-old boy who was abused and ended up being removed because the elders concluded that, since he had not resisted, he was also guilty. In other words, the boy was not only a victim of abuse, he was also re-victimized by being removed. And we are talking about a teenager who probably did not even fully understand what was happening. Psychologists explain very clearly that when a person, even an adult, suffers a sexual assault, they often freeze. Well, this boy was removed precisely for that reason, for not having resisted. The documentary also addresses the subject of Jehovah's Witness judicial committees. It shows how elders often ask deeply inappropriate questions, and how these committees function in practice as a parallel justice system, completely separate from the legal system of each country. In the documentary, they even mention the case of a 5-year-old girl who tried to explain that she was being abused by her father. Naturally, she used the language of a child that age, and the elders committed a shocking mistake. They confronted the girl with her own father. Later, the father was imprisoned by the country's justice system. But because there were not 2 witnesses to the abuse inside the congregation, he continued to be considered innocent. The documentary also addresses another issue, and several other topics as well, such as blood transfusions. It even shows that infamous issue of the magazine, Awake, in which children who had died after refusing transfusions were spoken of in praising terms, almost as if they were martyrs. Within the organization, values can sometimes become so inverted that people even end up boasting about children who died because they refused blood transfusions. And finally, the documentary also mentions doctrinal changes within the organization. The failed predictions about the end of the world, 1914, 1925, 1975, changes in position regarding organ transplants, vaccines, and many other issues. Some of those changes even cost dozens of people their lives. All the people who appear in the miniseries gradually bring up these topics, and the final result is that the general public is exposed to this entire reality.